Okay, welcome to this Edexcel GCSE Religious Studies paper 4A Buddhism tutorial. This is lesson 1. We're looking at the just introducing the different traditions of Buddhism. Now, there are actually maybe 3 or more traditions, but we will think about them as just 2 real forms of Buddhism. Today there are for example, Tibetan Buddhists who are from the sort of northern Buddhist tradition. These are what we would call a type of Buddhism called Mahayana Buddhism, developed much later in countries like Tibet and China and Japan. In the language of these countries, the origin was Sanskrit, and the word literally means the greater vehicle. About 54% of Buddhists today. The other type of Buddhists are Theravada. This is the oldest type of Buddhism that spread from India to the southern Asian countries like Sri Lanka and Thailand. And it's from the language of Pali, which literally means the school of the elders. It's fascinating, the origin of this in the pre-Buddhist period. About 36% of Buddhists today are Theravada, so Mahayana by much the larger tradition. Buddhism is a rich and complex and diverse religion. It has developed over 2,500 years, traveled around the globe. It's adapted and changed into lots of new forms. While it's useful to divide it up into these 2, could be more, perhaps 3 divisions. Theravada, as we've mentioned, is the living tradition, perhaps the oldest. It dates to the earliest aspect of Buddhism. Mahayana, which is a family of traditions that began to emerge around BCE 0, about the time of Jesus, with new scriptures and assumed greater importance in Central and East Asia, sort of the northern countries. The other type is Vajrayana, and it's really a Mahayana school of philosophy with very esoteric rituals. Some of them are a bit on the risque side, as it were, and became dominant in the Himalayan region. We will mention these, but probably not be studying them. So, next. So, if we think about the key teaching in Buddhism, that there are 3 jewels or 3 refuges that we should seek help within. There's some general features of Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism, but if you think about these 3 jewels, I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, I take refuge in the Sangha. We can use these to analyze the 2 different traditions. In terms of the first, the general features, it's from the Doctrine of the Elders. Perhaps this is a reference to the old republics that the Buddha's father would have been part of, and the way he structured the Buddhist Sangha in avoiding the monarchy. And lots of interesting stuff in the background here. This is classical Buddhism. It's very conservative. It wants to preserve texts, especially the earliest texts, the Pali texts. High degree of uniformity across the world, emphasizes monasticism, renunciation, official, proper Buddhism, as it were. And the goal is to escape samsara through realizing nibbana. You could link this perhaps to Catholicism, very similar. If you look at this geographically, here's the spread of, in particular, Theravada Buddhism today. And notice it's the sort of southern countries, Sri Lanka in the bottom there, and Thailand and Burma, and so on today. Mahayana general features has been called, it means the Great Way, and as opposed to what was called the Little Way, Hinayana, another type of Buddhism. A high degree of diversity. This is more like the Protestant tradition of Buddhism. Difficult to generalize, just as it's difficult to generalize about Protestants. Main modern forms are Zen Buddhism, Pure Land Buddhism, and Nihitrinian groups. This type of Buddhism would involve tantric or sort of use of objects and rituals and puja. Tibetan is the most famous of these, and perhaps Zen Buddhism and others. It emphasizes the fact we can all become a Buddha. We can all become a Bodhisattva. There have been lots of these people who have achieved this in history. Choosing rebirth to help all other beings is the point, not getting yourself enlightened, but making sure everybody else so much can get enlightened too. The spread of Mahayana Buddhism from Nepal and Tibet through into China, Chinese Buddhism, forms of Zen Buddhism in as far as Japan, and Zen Buddhism there you'll have heard of in parts of Mongolia. The Buddha in Theravada Buddhism. So the first refuge, I take refuge in the Buddha. Okay, the three jewels. The first of the three jewels would emphasize, Theravada Buddhists would emphasize the historical Buddha. A greater focus on devotion. He's seen as a teacher and a guide, an exemplar, not a god. The Buddha is dead physically, but he's still active in the world. This kind of Buddhism loves relics, a bit like Catholics who love relics, and revered through stupas or monuments. Images are a reminder. Relics. Sometimes though these images, stupas, contain actual physical relics, it's claimed. Devotion creates merit. Devotion to the relics, devotion to the images. Whereas within Mahayana Buddhism, there's a much more expanded concept of the Buddha, perhaps sort of mystical Protestant idea. It's a trans-historical, even cosmic presence, think liberal Christianity, that can influence the world. The Buddha remains active and can be encountered in visions and meditation. He can manifest himself in many different forms and places and times. Here we see a collection in the picture of different Bodhisattva. So the cosmic Bodhisattvas, awakened beings, can be worshipped as much as the original Buddha. The Buddha is continuing source of blessing, even perhaps salvation, via some forms of Buddhism. Pure Land Buddhism being one. Here is Amida in his Pure Land. More on that later. In terms of the Buddha, then the first jewel, the second jewel, Dharma, I take in the teaching of Buddhism. Well, the teaching of Mahayana Trikaya, Doctrine. There are three bodies of the Buddha. First of all, the Nirmanakana, meaning the Buddha in the world. That's examples of Buddhists, Bodhisattvas, I suppose. The Sambhogakaya, Buddha in heaven, and we can have visions of the Buddha who will help us. And the Dharmakaya, the Buddha in eternity, the Buddha as an abstract principle of the universe that's referred to perhaps in the texts. In terms of the second jewel in Theravada Buddhism, Dharma means teaching or truth, and Theravada Buddhism is based on the Pali Canon. The PC or Pali Canon is a body of scriptures that records the teachings, perhaps the early Buddhists, if not the Buddha. The Pali Canon can be divided into three baskets: the Sutra, the Vinaya, and the Adendharma. Okay, you just need to know the words: discourses, discipline, philosophical analysis, and commentaries on these. And a worthy one, an arahant, okay, is someone who's gone through the various steps or stages. Theravada Dharma, in principle, accepts the teachings of the early Buddhists, the Pali Canon, but adds extra scriptures, the Lotus Sutra, the Heart Sutra, the Pure Land Sutras of all these new forms of Buddhism. Important is the rhetoric of compassion, metta. Expanded concept of awakening, emphasis that the Bodhisattva ideal for all of us, diverse teachings depending on the sect or the tradition. Tantric Buddhism emphasizes ritual and the ideal of us all getting to the Buddha nature. The Theravada, the last of the three jewels, Theravada Sangha, I take refuge on the Sangha. Often in Theravada Buddhism, the emphasis on monastic Sangha and the difference, the distinction between the laity and the monks, with the proper Buddhists being the monks, the Catholic priests, as it were. Monks are the full-timers, they're celibate. Their role is to follow the three baskets, especially of the one of discipline, the Vinaya, and instruct the laity. Lay people practice dana, or giving to the monks, and this generates merit. A clear hierarchy is developed. I take refuge in the Mahayana Sangha. Generally, the distinction between monk and lay is broken down. There is a hierarchy, but the Sangha is more diverse, embracing all types of Buddhism. Sects have all types of differences and emphases. In Japan, monks, in fact, may marry and have families. That's very unusual. This would include nuns, generally your subordinate. So unlike Theravada Buddhism. Some sects de-emphasize the monk-laity divide, Judo, Shinshu, or Pure Land Buddhists. The modern period, importantly, lay groups have emerged, Soka, Gakya. So, just some summary. Theravada and Mahayana traditions share many basic principles, practices, and institutional structures. Theravada is the more united, coherent tradition based on the conservation of the early teachings, whereas Mahayana is more diverse, inspired by the new bodies of scriptures and new Buddhas or Bodhisattva cults. Mahayana Buddhism evolved in East Asia, giving rise to many new traditions. Theravada preserved in Southern Asia. Mahayana represents itself as a higher path. Mahayana has an expanded concept of the Buddha, distinctive teachings and texts, especially the Bodhisattva ideal, and more diverse Sangha. Just a tease, as it were. The Dalai Lama says, Buddhism is not a religion, Buddhism is a science of the mind. Is the Dalai Lama a Theravada or a Mahayana Buddhist? Do you know which part of the world does he come from? Thanks for listening. Next video will come up shortly.